My son called me on a Wednesday afternoon, and I almost didn't recognize his voice. Not because anything was wrong with the connection. The line was clear. I heard him fine. It was something underneath the words, a flatness, a careful steadiness, that I hadn't heard from him since he was 19 years old and trying to tell me his mother and I were getting a divorce before I'd figured it out myself. He'd done the same thing then, kept his voice level, tried to sound like a man who had everything under control. He didn't call on Wednesdays, that was the first thing. He called on Sundays, usually around noon, after his wife got back from her run and their daughter had eaten lunch. It was a ritual, it had been a ritual for going on 6 years. Wednesday meant something was different. Just checking in, he said. How's the knee? The knee was fine. The knee had been fine for 3 months. He knew that. Same as always, I said. What's going on? Nothing. I was in the car and thought of you. I let it sit there. He'd never once called me from a car because he thought of me. He loved me. I knew that. But that wasn't how we worked. I told myself I was reading too much into it. I'd been retired for 8 months at that point, and retirement does things to a man's mind when he's not careful. You start filling quiet hours with patterns that may or may not be there. I told myself that. I almost believed it. I spent 34 years as a licensed clinical social worker specializing in crisis intervention, mostly with veterans. I'd worked with men and women who had learned to hide everything, fear, grief, shame, behind a composed exterior. I knew how to read a voice. I knew what it sounded like when someone was working very hard to sound fine. I heard it on that Wednesday call and I chose, for once in my professional life, to let it go. That was a mistake. My son's name is Nicholas. He's 31 now. He married a woman named Priya 6 years ago, and they have a daughter, Cora, who just turned 4. They live about 50 minutes from me in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio, in a house they bought 2 years after the wedding. Nicholas works in logistics management. Priya teaches 2nd grade. They are careful people, the thoughtful people, the kind of couple that researches appliances before buying them and keeps a shared household spreadsheet that Nicholas showed me once with what I recognized as genuine pride. They were not reckless. That matters. About 2 months before that Wednesday call, Nicholas had mentioned a man in passing. They'd started attending a new church, not for religious reasons exactly, more for the community, the structure, the something to do on Sunday mornings that young families sometimes need. The man was a deacon there. He'd introduced himself after a service, mentioned he worked in private wealth management, and said if Nicholas ever wanted a second opinion on anything financial, he was happy to talk. No pressure, just neighborly. Nicholas mentioned it the way you mention things that don't mean anything, just a name, just a guy from church. I didn't think about it again. I should have. The man's name was Alderton Graves. He was in his mid-50s, silver-haired, with a kind of unhurried confidence that reads as competence in a first conversation. Nicholas described him as calm. Priya said he reminded her of her uncle, which was the highest compliment she knew how to give a stranger. By the time Nicholas called me on that Wednesday, Alderton Graves had been in my son's life for 9 weeks. Here is what I've come to understand about how a certain kind of person operates. They don't rush. Rushing is for amateurs, for phone scammers reading off a script, for the pop-up windows that tell you your computer has a virus. The patient ones, the dangerous ones, they move at the speed of trust. They find a container that already holds it, a neighborhood, a workplace, a church. Alderton Graves had found a very good container. The church Nicholas and Priya attended had about 200 families, a lot of them young professionals, dual-income households, people who were starting to accumulate something, and who hadn't yet built the financial infrastructure to know what to do with it. A 403b that needed rolling over. A small inheritance sitting in a low-yield savings account. A couple who just sold their starter home and had equity sitting somewhere and weren't sure what came next. He wasn't there for all of them. He was there for one at a time. He'd started with the pastor, not as a target, but as a character reference. He'd made a donation to the building fund. He'd helped the finance committee review their insurance coverage and charged them nothing. He'd given a Sunday school talk on financial literacy that 3 separate families mentioned to Nicholas as helpful. By the time he'd turned his attention to my son, he'd spent 6 weeks making the church his. Nicholas didn't know any of this. He found out later, the way we all found out things later. What Nicholas knew was that Alderton Graves was a respected member of his community, who had, over the course of about 6 weeks, become something that felt like a mentor. They'd had coffee twice. They'd talked about risk tolerance and index funds, and the difference between a financial advisor who was a fiduciary and one who wasn't. Nicholas had come away from those conversations feeling like he'd gotten 6 months of financial education for free. He'd mentioned, during one of those coffees, that his father had retired recently, that his father had a pension from the state, some savings, and owned his house. He didn't think anything of it. He thought he was just talking. The Wednesday call bothered me for 2 days. On Friday morning, I was in the garage looking for my socket set when my phone buzzed. A text from Nicholas. "Hey, any chance you're free Sunday? Could use a second opinion on something. Priya's parents are coming next weekend, so that's out. Sunday works if you can swing it." I texted back that Sunday was fine. I'd come for lunch. He wrote back immediately. "Great. Thanks, Dad." He didn't say what he needed a second opinion on. I drove up on Sunday. Priya made soup. Cora showed me a drawing she'd done at preschool of what she said was a horse, but looked more like an enthusiastic rectangle. We ate at the kitchen table, and I let things be normal until Priya took Cora upstairs for her nap, and it was just Nicholas and me with our coffee. He put a folder on the table. "I want you to look at this," he said. "I trust you." The folder contained a 12-page investment proposal. The cover sheet had a logo for something called Keystone Preservation Group, LLC. The document inside was well formatted, professionally printed, full of correct-sounding terminology. It outlined something Alderton Graves called a stabilized income reserve, a vehicle, according to the document, designed specifically for people within 5 years of retirement or recently retired, meant to protect principal while generating modest, reliable returns during a period of market volatility. The return projections were conservative. That was the first thing I noticed. Not 10%, not 12. 6.3. 6.8. The kind of numbers that don't set off immediate alarms because they sound reasonable. I read through it slowly. Nicholas watched me. "He gave this to you?" I asked. He asked if I wanted to have it looked over by someone I trusted before we made any decisions. He actually suggested it. "Of course he did. Has he talked about me?" I said. Nicholas hesitated in a way that told me everything. "A little. I mentioned you'd retired. He asked if you'd had a chance to think about restructuring your savings for the long term. He said retirees with pensions sometimes don't realize how exposed their liquid assets still are." I set the folder down. "What did you tell him about what I have?" Nicholas's jaw tightened. Not defensiveness. Something worse than that. Recognition. He was beginning to see the shape of something he hadn't seen before, and watching him see it was one of the hardest things I'd experienced sitting at that kitchen table. "I told him about the pension," he said quietly, "and that you owned the house, and roughly what you had in savings." He paused. I thought I was just answering questions. I reached across and put my hand on his arm. "You were," I said. "He was just asking the wrong ones." I want to take a moment here to say something clearly, because it matters. My son is not naive. He is not careless. He has a graduate degree. He reads. He pays attention. He is the kind of person who double-checks the FDIC insurance limits before opening a new savings account. He was also a 31-year-old man who had found something that felt like community in a new place, who had met someone who seemed to want to help without wanting anything in return, and who loved his father enough to try to find him resources he thought might be useful. That combination, trust, goodwill, love, is exactly what a patient, methodical person relies on. Alderton Graves didn't exploit a weakness in my son's character. He manufactured a strength and then borrowed it. I had spent 34 years watching exploitation happen to people, others called vulnerable. Veterans with PTSD, men and women who'd come back from deployments to find their families fractured, their finances gone, their sense of the world fundamentally altered. I'd watched predators find the cracks. What I hadn't spent enough time thinking about was how the same thing could reach through the people I loved most. I asked Nicholas if I could keep the folder. He said yes. I asked him not to say anything to Alderton Graves yet, not to cancel any meetings, not to act differently. He looked at me for a long moment. "Dad," he said, "what are you going to do?" "I'm going to make a phone call." The first call was to a woman I'd worked with years ago during a financial exploitation case involving one of my veteran clients. Her name was Roslyn, and she'd spent the last 12 years with the Ohio Department of Commerce's Division of Securities, working specifically on affinity fraud. The kind that operates through trust networks, through churches, through community organizations. I'd given her a referral that had helped her close a case in 2019. We'd stayed in touch. She picked up on the third ring. I described what I had, the document, the LLC, the church context, the timeline of relationship building, the way he'd gathered financial information about me through my son before I'd ever heard his name. She was quiet for a moment. LLC registration? She said. Keystone Preservation Group. I'll send you the document tonight. Don't withdraw, she said. Don't confront. Does your son have another meeting with him scheduled? He did, that Thursday. Alderton had said he'd walk Nicholas through the enrollment specifics, the contribution minimums, the lock-in period, the quarterly reporting structure. Keep it, she said. And I want your son to ask him casually if this is something appropriate for a recently retired parent. Let him bring it back to you himself. Don't tip him that you're involved. That Thursday, Nicholas sat across from Alderton Graves at a coffee shop 2 miles from the church and asked as casually as he could manage whether the stabilized income reserve might be something his retired father should consider. He said I'd been resistant to talking to new advisors, but that he might have more luck if Alderton reached out directly. He told me afterward that Alderton had smiled and said, I was hoping you'd bring that up. Alderton Graves called my cell phone that Friday evening. I didn't know he had my number. Nicholas confirmed later that he hadn't given it to him. Alderton had said Nicholas texted it to him, which Nicholas was certain he hadn't done. I didn't pursue how he'd gotten it. Some things you find out later. Some things you already know. He introduced himself warmly. Said Nicholas had mentioned me. Said he'd heard I'd had a distinguished career in social services. Said he had a deep respect for that kind of work. He asked how retirement was treating me. I told him it was an adjustment. He laughed in a way that managed to sound both understanding and conspiratorial. Said the financial industry had let retirees down badly over the past decade. Said he'd made it his personal mission to find better options. Said he didn't work for any of the big firms anymore, precisely because the big firms weren't interested in protecting people. They were interested in commissions. He talked for 11 minutes before he mentioned the product. When he did, he was careful. He didn't call it an investment. He called it a positioning tool. He said it was designed specifically for people who had already done the hard work and simply needed to protect what they'd earned. He said the enrollment window for the current cycle closed at the end of the month. Not to pressure me, just so I had the timing. There it was. I told him I was interested but cautious by nature. He said that was exactly the right instinct. I asked if we could meet in person. He said he'd love that. I suggested my house. Said I was more comfortable on my own turf. He said that sounded perfect. I called Rosalind the moment I hung up. He took it, I said. Good, she said. Saturday morning, he suggested it. I want to be precise about what happened next, because I think precision matters when someone might read this and be in a similar situation and wonder what to do. I did not handle this myself. I want to be absolutely clear about that. What I did was give Rosalind everything I had. The folder, the LLC registration I'd looked up through the Ohio Secretary of State's business search, the timeline of contact Nicholas had described, the phone call recording I'd made with Rosalind's guidance using a method that's legal in Ohio as a single-party state. She took it to the appropriate people. She told me what to do on Saturday and what not to do. I followed her instructions exactly. What she told me was this: let him come, let him present, receive any documents he brings, and do not sign anything. If he asks why you're hesitating, tell him you want your attorney to look it over. Don't say you don't have an attorney if you don't. Just say it. Alderton Graves pulled into my driveway at 9:30 on a Saturday morning in a gray Lexus that was clean in the way rental cars are clean. He was exactly what his phone voice had suggested. Silver hair, easy posture, the handshake of a man who had given a lot of handshakes. He sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd eaten breakfast alone since my wife moved to assisted living 2 years ago. The same table where I'd graded my own children's report cards years ago when this house was full. He spread his materials out slowly: the Keystone Preservation Group brochure, a 1-page summary sheet, an account opening packet with a placeholder for a signature and a wire transfer routing number printed at the bottom. He was very good. He didn't oversell. He asked me questions and listened to my answers, as if they genuinely informed what he said next. He referenced my career with what sounded like real admiration. He talked about a veteran he'd worked with in a previous capacity, a story designed, I recognized, to create common ground. Then he said, "For someone in your position, what I'd recommend is moving a portion of your liquid savings into the reserve before the current window closes. Just a portion. Something in the range of 40 to 60,000, depending on what you're comfortable with. The lock-in is 18 months, but the quarterly statements are fully transparent, and you can designate a beneficiary." I nodded slowly. "That sounds reasonable," I said. "Can I hold on to these to show my attorney?" He smiled, without missing a beat. "Of course, take all the time you need. I just ask that you let me know by Wednesday, given the window." He was in his car and out of my driveway by 11:15. I photographed every page of the documents and sent them to Roslyn before his car had reached the end of my street. Here is what the investigation found. Keystone Preservation Group, LLC, had been registered in Delaware 18 months earlier, a state chosen specifically because Delaware LLC registrations require minimal disclosure and can be completed online in under an hour. The fund account listed on the wire transfer routing form traced to a shell account at a regional bank in Georgia. The account had received deposits from 4 other individuals over the previous 8 months. Amounts ranging from $22,000 to $89,000. 3 of those individuals were members of other churches in other Ohio cities. One was a man in his 70s who attended a Rotary Club in a suburb of Indianapolis. None of them had received a single quarterly statement. Alderton Graves was not his legal name. His legal name I won't print here, both because the legal matter was still active as of the last time I spoke with Roslyn, and because the name itself isn't the point. The method is the point. The same method across 3 states, with minor variations. A trusted institution instead of a neighborhood. Older targets, often recently retired, often experiencing some form of transition, a move, a loss, a new community. He found them where they were soft. He stayed patient until the ground was ready. When they picked him up, it was a Tuesday. I called Nicholas as soon as I knew. He was quiet on the phone for a long time after I told him. I gave him the keys, he said finally. It wasn't a question. No, I said. He built a whole locksmith shop to make them. You handed him nothing he wasn't already working to get. I heard Cora in the background, asking for something. Dad, he said. I'm sorry. You did right, I told him. You brought it to me. You listened when I said to hold still. That's exactly what you were supposed to do. There was a pause. That folder he gave me, Nicholas said. I almost just signed it. The week before I called you, I almost just said yes and signed it. Priya and I talked about putting 60,000 in. He stopped. That's our emergency fund. That's everything. I didn't say anything for a moment. I know, I said. How did you know something was wrong? Just from a Wednesday phone call. I had to think about that. The honest answer was that I almost didn't. I'd told myself I was imagining things. I'd decided not to follow the feeling. If Roslyn's investigation hadn't found what it found, if Alderton had been slower, more patient, if he'd given Nicholas actual returns for a year before pivoting toward me, I'm not sure the Wednesday phone call would have been enough. What saved it wasn't that I was smart. I spent 34 years learning to read what people hide, and I still almost missed it. What saved it was that my son, somewhere underneath his composed and careful exterior, knew something was wrong. And he knew, without knowing exactly what he was doing, to call me on a Wednesday, not to say anything, just to see if I'd notice. I've been thinking about that ever since. When Nicholas was about 13, I went through a period at work that I don't talk about often. 2 clients in 1 year, both veterans, both men I'd known for a long time. It wasn't my fault in any technical sense. I know that now. I knew it then. But knowing it technically and carrying it are different things, and for about 6 months I was not easy to live with. Nicholas was old enough to notice, young enough not to know what to do with what he noticed. At some point during that stretch, he started calling me on Wednesday evenings from his room, even though I was right downstairs. He'd call my cell phone and say he had a question about homework, or he'd read something, or he just wanted to talk about nothing. We'd talk for 20 minutes or half an hour. It became a thing. I never told him it helped. I don't know that I fully understood at the time that it did. He stopped when things got better. Neither of us ever mentioned it. When he called me on that Wednesday from his car, he hadn't called me midweek unprompted in almost 18 years. I didn't make the connection until later. Maybe he didn't either. I'm still not sure whether it was conscious. But somewhere in him, when he needed to tell me something he didn't have words for yet, he found the same frequency we'd used when he was 13, the same quiet Wednesday signal. He didn't know what he was reaching for. He just reached. I'm glad I answered. After it was all over, on a Sunday in December, I drove up for Cora's birthday party. There was more sugar consumed than I thought was medically advisable, and 3 4-year-olds running through the living room, and Priya's mother reorganizing the kitchen in a way that Priya was pretending not to notice. At some point in the afternoon, Nicholas and I ended up in the backyard while the party noise continued inside. It was cold. He had his hands in his pockets. We stood there for a minute without talking, the way fathers and sons sometimes do when they've run out of surface things to say and haven't quite landed on the real ones. I've been thinking, he said finally, about what you said. That thing you told me about how he worked. Which part? The part about how they find something people already trust and borrow it. He looked out at the yard. That's the part that stays with me, that he never had to earn it from me directly. He just found something I already believed in and stood next to it. I nodded. That should make people angrier than it does, he said. It should, I agreed. He was quiet again for a moment. I'm putting a call on the calendar, he said. Wednesdays, 6 o'clock, we can just talk, or nothing, but it's there. I looked at him. You don't have to do that, I said. I know, he said. He meant it, and I knew he meant it. We went back inside to watch Cora smash her birthday cake, with the focused determination of someone who has waited her entire 4 years for exactly this moment. And I sat at their kitchen table, and drank bad coffee and thought about what my son had said. They find something you already trust and stand next to it. Here is what I've come to believe after 34 years of working with people in crisis, and after everything that happened in those months. The people who want to take from you are patient. They are methodical. They will find the things you love and use them as hallways into your life. The only thing that stops them, the only thing that has ever really stopped them, is someone paying attention on the other end. Call the people you love on a Wednesday sometimes, for no reason. Answer when they call on a day that isn't their day. Notice the voice underneath the words. The signal doesn't have to be a code. It doesn't have to be anything formal. It just has to be the kind of attention that says, I'm here, I'm listening. If something's wrong, I'll notice. My son noticed I wasn't listening, so he found a way to make me listen without asking. That's what saved us.